Hi there, modern world history students. We're beginning unit number 7, the rise of totalitarian dictators. And these dictators who we're going to study in this unit took control of their countries during the years in between World War I and World War II. So in many ways, this unit bridges the gap between World War I and World War II and helps to explain why World War I proved not to be the war to end all wars, but rather why it actually set the stage for a second World War 20 years later. So we're going to look at section 1 and section 2 today. Section 1 is an introduction to the extreme systems of government that totalitarianism arose out of and how it was a part of those extreme systems of government. So, the purpose of Section 1 is for you to be able to explain how totalitarianism is similar to and at the same time different from fascism and communism, and how all of them tend toward dictatorship. So, let's start there. So, let's start with communism. And I'm at the top of page 4, top left-hand corner of page 4 in your unit packet. You already know a little bit about communism because we studied Karl Marx and the idea of communism in Unit 4 on industrialization. And maybe you remember that in communism, the government takes control of all of the means of production or instruments of production, everything that is used to make things. So the farms and the farm equipment, which are used to produce food, the railroads and the electrical power plants that are used to transport things and provide power for things, the factories themselves and all the machines inside of them. All of those are taken control of by the government. The government owns and operates all of those sort of businesses, farms, railroads, banks, uh, power plants, factories. They all come under the control of the government. The government owns and operates them. There is no private business at all in a communist system. Now, do you remember why governments, or why under communism, governments take control of all the means of production? What is the goal? What are they trying to accomplish? Take about 5 or 10 seconds and kind of review in your mind. Think about what they're trying to accomplish in a communist system. So if you remember, the purpose in communism is to try to achieve equality in society, to try to eliminate social classes. In communism, it was believed that the people who own and operate the farms and the railroads and the banks and the factories were using their control over the means of production to take advantage of, to exploit the working class, the proletariat, and to not pay them the full value of what they were creating through their labor. And so the idea then was to have the government take control of all of the factories and farms and railroads and operate them in such a way that the workers did get the full value, their fair share of the full value that they had helped to create. And in doing so, to eliminate inequality in society. So, in a way, in a communist system, all of your economic choices are made by the government. We call that a command economy. And the reason why the government in communism takes away all of your economic choices is that the government wants to ensure that everyone is equal. That's the purpose of communism. And so the government will dictate what's going to be produced, how much is going to be produced, when it's going to be produced, what will the price for it be. But the government will also dictate to workers what job they'll do and how much they'll be paid and when they'll work. And so there's no freedom of choice in the area of economics in a communist system. In a communist system, the government controls the economy and controls all of your economic choices and decisions. Now, fascism, you may have heard of sort of out there in popular society, maybe on the internet somewhere or on social media. People throw around the term fascist. but we haven't actually dealt with this yet. I'm going to give you a very, very basic definition of it, but later on, when we study Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism, I'll give you a much more specific definition. So, if in communism, government controls all of your economic choices, in fascism, government seeks to control what I would call your personal or private choices. Because in fascism, government is trying to control how you think. It's trying to control what you believe. And so a lot of the choices that you might make in your personal life that might shape what you think and what you believe, how you think and what you believe, those choices are now taken control of by the government in a fascist system. So think about some of the choices that you might consider personal or private that the government might take control over if they wanted to sort of influence or control how you think and what you believe. Again, take 5 or 10 seconds and try to think of some examples. Well, the government in a fascist system, because they're trying to control what you think, how you believe, what you believe, they might take control of what you're allowed to read or what you are allowed to view on television or on the internet. They might take control of what websites or social media you have access to, are allowed to have access to. They might take control of what kind of songs you're allowed to listen to, or what kind of television viewing, program viewing you're allowed to see. Maybe they would take control of your religion or even your education to the point where, in our school and certainly in this class, I try to teach you information to help you make up your own mind about some things. But perhaps in a fascist system, the government would not be teaching you information to help you make up your mind, but the government would be telling you exactly what you must believe. Um, so those are the kinds of personal, what we would usually consider personal or private choices that are taken over when you have a fascist government. The government takes over those choices because they're looking to influence or determine how you think and what you believe. So in communism, the government takes control of all of your economic choices. In fascism, the government takes control of all of your personal choices. So what then is totalitarianism? Well, you might have sort of figured it out because the word total is seen in totalitarianism. In totalitarianism, the government is seeking to control all of your choices. That is total control over every aspect of your life from the moment you are born until the moment you die. That's the idea of totalitarianism. The government controls all of your economic choices and all of your personal choices. And so I guess there's not a lot to say about totalitarianism that we haven't already said about communism and fascism, except to say that in a sense, it's a combination of both. The government seeks total control over your life, so they take control of your economic choices and your personal choices. That's totalitarianism. Now, to be truthful, all three of these extreme systems of government tend toward dictatorship. Because anytime you're going to deny people freedom of choice, whether it is economic choice or personal choice, you essentially have to bail out on democracy. Because generally speaking, if you want to keep your government as a democratic government, you can't accomplish any of these things. Because when given a choice politically, when given a political choice, most people will not vote to have someone take away their other choices, their economic choices, or their personal choices. Usually not. So typically, in a communist society, a fascist society, or in a totalitarian society, you won't have a democratic system of government. You're going to have a dictatorship. Another thing that you'll run into is that communism and you'll see how this works out in Russia as it became something called the Soviet Union. Communism may start out as communism only, communism and not fascism. The problem that you run into is that in almost every place where communism has been attempted, it has evolved into totalitarianism. And I think the reason for that is that in general, people like having choice in economics. They like being able to choose their own job. They like being able to either, maybe take a job that pays less because it makes them happier, or, pursue a job that makes them more money because that's the thing that they value the most. But in communism, those sorts of choices are taken away. And I think that what happens in almost every communist system, you get pushback. And so the government realizes that people need assistance in being fully committed to communism. That is, you need to control their thoughts as well as their economic decisions. You need to control their beliefs as well as their economic decisions, because if you don't, they'll tend to turn against communism. And so, because they like choice, they like freedom of choice in economics. So, in order to convince them that they don't like freedom of choice in economics, you have to take control of their personal decisions as well in order to change their mind, change the way they think, change the way what they believe about communism. And so, if you look at most communist societies throughout the 20th century, they start as being just communist societies, but they almost always evolve into totalitarian societies with dictators. So, before we move into our first example of how this happened during the 20th century, I want to put these on a map. I'm going to simply take this opportunity to put everything on a map right here at the beginning of the unit because it's relatively easy to do it right now. There's not a lot of map work in this unit, and it's nice to get these out of the way right at the beginning. So the first place we're going to study where totalitarianism emerged is Russia. And you'll remember that Russia occupies, when we look at a map of Europe, Russia occupies essentially the entire eastern portion of the map, or as we look at it, the right-hand portion of the map. So if you sort of, draw a line, this is the Black Sea here, and then you see this sort of weird-shaped peninsula here. If you draw a line sort of north to south there, anything east of that is essentially Russia, or one of the states that eventually joined Russia to form something called the Soviet Union. So Russia remained Russia through the year 1922. In the year 1922, it joined with some neighboring states to form something called the Soviet Union, and that will be part of our lesson coming up in the next couple of sections. So when we're putting it on the map, up until 1917, Russia is simply Russia. From 1917 until 1991, Russia joined with other states to form something called the Soviet Union, a union of states. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart, and Russia simply became Russia again. So, depending upon what time period we're talking about, we'll refer to this as either Russia or the Soviet Union. When I begin talking about Russia in this unit, it will still be Russia, but by the time we're done, it will have evolved into the Soviet Union. Now, when Russia was still Russia, its capital was called St. Petersburg, or in Russian, Petrograd, Peter's city, Petrograd, Peter's city. And you can call it by either of those two names, St. Petersburg or Petrograd. With St. Petersburg, it's a lot to write. Petrograd is shorter. St. Petersburg can sometimes be mistaken with a city in Florida as well. So you might find Petrograd easier to remember. For most of the story that I'm going to tell you today, the Russians referred to the city as Petrograd. But either way, today and in our next lesson. But either one's fine. After the Soviet Union was formed, the capital became Moscow. Moscow is actually Russia's largest city, and when the Soviet Union was formed, it also became the capital. And Moscow remained as the capital until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So take a moment and add those to your map. You can just use the map right on this same page, page 4. Okay, the second country that we're going to study that became totalitarian was Italy. And Italy, you've sort of been finding since the beginning of the year. Hopefully by now that familiar boot shape is easy for you to find. So I imagine that you probably know where Italy is already, but if not, add it to the map. And add also its capital, Rome, the city of Rome, located along the west coast of Italy, about halfway down the boot, where the boot laces might be if it had laces. And then finally, we'll be studying Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, which is located sort of in the center of Europe, kind of on the northern tier there. And so I'll ask you to add Germany. Now, don't get hung up on its exact borders. Remember, I'm most interested not in having you replicate the borders with geographic precision, but simply to understand the location of Germany relative to the location of other places in Europe. So there's Germany and its capital, Berlin. So if you haven't already done so, please add Germany and its capital, Berlin, to the map. And of course, pause the video if you need more time. All right. So now I want to start our first sort of study in how a country became a totalitarian country. So this is section 2, and it introduces you to the conditions in Russia that contributed to what was called the Russian Revolution. I hope that by the end of section 2, you'll be able to explain why Russia was ripe for a revolution by the spring of 1917, February, March of 1917. So really late winter of 1917, even more so than spring. So why was Russia ripe for a revolution by February, March of 1917? I'll remind you about the Russo-Japanese War, introduce you to Father Georgy Gapon and the event Bloody Sunday. We'll talk about the Duma, and then introduce you to Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra of Russia. And then finally, we'll mention the German invasion, which took place during World War I. And all of these were contributors to Russia being ripe for a revolution by the spring of 1917. So what you may have figured out is that I am taking you backward in time some. I'm taking you back prior to the outbreak of World War I, the First World War, and we're talking about how conditions in Russia were already ripe for a revolution, even before World War I broke out. You may remember that World War I put particular stress on Russian society that ultimately sort of broke the camel's back and was the immediate cause of the Russian Revolution. But as a matter of fact, there were conditions in Russia that made it ripe for revolution even before the war came. So let's start with the fact that that Russia in 1905 had fought a war against the Japanese. And you might remember that that was called the Russo-Japanese War. Now, that war started with a stunning victory of the Japanese Navy over Russia's Pacific Fleet. The Japanese had attacked the Russian army by surprise, or I'm sorry, the Russian Pacific Fleet, its navy, by surprise, and had really shredded the Russian fleet. You see a Russian battleship here in a state of capsizing, tumbling over after being battered by Japanese ships, by Japanese battleships. The war, however, did not remain a purely naval war. It made its way onto the land as Japanese forces fought it out with Russian forces in Manchuria, that northeastern part of China. When Russia mobilizes its army, back then, when Russia would mobilize its army, it did so by pulling millions and millions of peasants off of the farm fields and drafting them into the army. And while that allowed Russia to have potentially a huge, huge army drafting millions of peasants, it also resulted in food shortages in Russia. Because you think about it, all of those peasants who worked in the fields were now no longer working in the fields producing crops. And so times of war were always times of great difficulty for people living as part of Russian society, because it was always a time when food was scarce. In the case of the Russo-Japanese War, by late 1905 and certainly going into the spring of 1906, these food shortages were already beginning to show up, particularly in the large cities, including the capital, St. Petersburg, um, or Petrograd, as I mentioned before. And in Petrograd or St. Petersburg, um, there were protests. I mean, people were dissatisfied. I mean, think about the French Revolution, right? A lot of that started with people not being able to have access to the grain and the bread that they needed to feed their families. Well, the same thing happened in Russia during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, 1906. In the big cities like the capital, St. Petersburg, there was not enough grain, not enough bread for people to feed their families. And so there were protests against the war and against the lack of food. Some of these protests were led by Father Georgy Gapon, Father Georgy Gapon, George. Um, he was a Russian Orthodox priest, so he was a man of God. He was a man of faith, a church leader. Russian Orthodox Christianity is a form of Christianity. And he was the leader of these peaceful protests. The protesters wanted the Tsar, who was the ruler of Russia, and his family to know that they were suffering and that their families were suffering. Of course, the Tsar and his family were not suffering. They lived in a palace and had plenty of food to eat. They lived in luxury. But the regular people of the city of St. Petersburg did not in any way. And so these protests were meant to get the attention of the Tsar. However, the Tsar did not tolerate protests, and as a matter of fact, ordered the Imperial Guard, which was the division of the Russian army that was given the job of being the Tsar's personal bodyguard, personal protection. He ordered the Imperial Guard to to shoot at the protesters. So as the protesters approached the Tsar's palace in St. Petersburg, the Imperial Guard fired on them. Dozens were killed and hundreds were injured in an incident that became known as Bloody Sunday, 1905. Father Gapon eventually was killed himself, not during the Bloody Sunday incident, but shortly thereafter. And with that, the protests sort of faded away. This was sort of typical of 19th and early 20th century Europe. Think about the various revolts that took place during 1848 or at other times in the 19th century. Usually they were crushed through military force. And this was another example of an absolute monarch, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, using military force to crush what was in fact a peaceful protest. The Tsar, however, had more fundamental problems. And Russia, I guess, is a better way of saying it. Russia had more fundamental problems to deal with. Russian society was extremely uh, divided between masses of impoverished peasants, desperately poor peasants, and on the other hand, an extremely privileged and wealthy elite. As a matter of fact, you could say that Russian society in the early 20th century wasn't much different from Russian society in the 13th century. Russian society had not modernized. It was still, in a lot of ways, a feudal society. There was, you had these extremely wealthy nobles who possessed huge tracts of land, large estates, and You had millions of impoverished peasants who owned no land themselves and who therefore really had no choice except to work on the land that was owned by the nobles. And for the work that they did, which was this sort of backbreaking agricultural labor, it would remind you of medieval serfs. They received, barely enough to keep themselves fed and sheltered. I mean, you can see the kind of housing they were living in and clothed, and to keep their families fed and sheltered and clothed. And so the great mass of the Russian people lived as these peasants lived, whom you see in the picture on the right, these being young people. Um, Russia had not modernized really as a society. They had not developed an economy based on trade or commerce. Certainly not really an economy that was industrial, based on manufacturing, like Britain or France or Germany or the United States. And so, by far, the huge majority of the Russian people were these impoverished peasants. On the other hand, you had this tiny minority of Russian society who were these wealthy elites. They might be wealthy nobles, landowners, like those whom you see in the picture on the top right, or they might be wealthy leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, like some of those whom you see on the bottom right, who are seated with other nobles and even some military officers, and perhaps even some prominent business people as well. There weren't a lot of manufacturing, there weren't a lot of factories in Russia, but in the big cities there were some. But the people on the right on your screen here represented this tiny minority of the Russian population. The vast majority were these extremely impoverished peasants. And so Russian society, as I said, very much resembled medieval society, with a huge gap between the extremely wealthy and the desperately poor. And that sort of gap is sort of what manifested itself on Bloody Sunday in 1905, when the poor, who had nothing, not even enough food to eat and to keep their families alive, protested the Tsar and his family, who, like these nobles and leaders of the church, lived in luxury and always had enough food. The Tsar did not sympathize. Instead, he had them gunned down. And that was, pretty typical. That was pretty typical of the Tsar and the elite's view of the peasants. They were subjects to be ruled over. They didn't have a right to an opinion. They certainly didn't have a right to protest. And so, that was kind of the mentality, and that was the shape of Russian society prior to the revolution in 1917. And you can see how just that alone would be a contributor to a revolution. Now, the Tsar sort of recognized this. There's Tsar Nicholas II on the right, the absolute monarch, ruler of Russia. He sort of understood this. Bloody Sunday had brought home to him, at least at some level, that there was anger, that there was dissatisfaction among the people of St. Petersburg. Now, did he think that they were justified in that anger? Well, apparently not, because he had them all shot down. But he at least understood that they were angry and that perhaps something ought to be done to eliminate some of that anger, to release some of that pressure and that tension. And so, in 1905, the Tsar created something called the Duma. And the Duma was supposed to be a kind of a legislature, kind of a parliament, a place where the Russian people could elect representatives and in that way feel like they had some sort of voice in Russia's government. The Duma was not meant to actually give them a voice in Russia's government, and it, as a matter of fact, didn't. But it was meant to give them the impression that they had a voice in Russia's government. It was a kind of a pretend parliament that was meant to create that impression. Now, the reason why I say that in reality it didn't actually give them a voice or give them real influence over Russia's government is this. Once the Duma was created, only about 20% of the seats in the Duma were reserved for the elected representatives of the Russian people. 80% of the seats were held by nobles, wealthy, elite, leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the handful of like factory owner types who there were in Russia. So it was supposed to be a legislature wherein the people of Russia would be able to elect representatives and have a voice. But their voice was only a tiny fraction of the full Duma. Most of the Duma was still dominated by the elites. Remember, it wasn't meant to be a real parliament. It was meant to be a pretend parliament to give the Russian people the impression that they had a voice in government, but to not actually give them a voice in government. Also, the Tsar could dissolve the Duma anytime he wished. So if the Duma seemed to be going in a direction that he didn't like, he could simply dissolve it. In some cases, the Duma was meeting yearly, but in some cases it met for only a few weeks before the Tsar simply decided to dissolve it and send everybody home. Furthermore, the Duma could not actually make laws. It was not a true parliament, a true legislature with the power to make laws like the British Parliament or the US Congress. It only had the power to suggest laws to Czar Nicholas II. The Tsar continued to be an absolute monarch, and he therefore made the final decision on what became laws and what didn't become laws. So, in so many ways, the Duma really was not a solution for the people of Russia. It didn't give them a real voice, real influence over their government. It was just meant to give them that impression. And it didn't take long before the Russian people sort of figured that out, sort of understood that. And so they didn't have any faith in the Duma. The creation of the Duma did not, in the long run, um, cause the Russian people to sort of stop thinking of themselves as being taken advantage of by the elites and by the Tsar. So, just when you think about it, just the basics of Russian society, a society in which there was an enormous gap between the extremely rich and the desperately poor, with no apparent way to ever close that gap. A society in which the leader of the government, the Tsar, regarded the regular people of Russia as subjects to be treated essentially as slaves who were not really allowed to have a voice, and if they tried to have a voice, to be gunned down. And then, with the creation of the Duma, really no opportunity to have a real voice in government. And when you take all of those things and combine them together, you're looking at a society that is ripe for a revolution. And then came the First World War. And if you remember, at the very beginning of the First World War, Russia seemed to have great potential. They surprised the Germans by attacking Germany before their army was fully mobilized. Germany's Schlieffen Plan relied on the idea that Russia would take at least 6 weeks, probably more like 8 weeks, 60 days, to mobilize fully their army. And so the Germans counted on not having to fight the Russians for the first 6 weeks, 8 weeks of the war. But if you remember, the Russians then mobilized their army partially and then attacked as quickly as they could. They caught the Germans by surprise. But then at the Battle of Tannenberg, they got devastatingly defeated at the hands of the German army. And from that point on, the Russian army was utterly demoralized and in a state of retreat, really for most of the remainder of the war. The German army invaded Russia, and as the Germans pushed deeper and deeper into Russian territory, the situation in Russia grew more and more dire because not only did you have the usual problem in Russia of drafting millions of peasants into the army and therefore not having them available to farm the fields and to harvest crops. And so, as usual, you had this problem of a food shortage during the war. But also, then, as the German army plunged deeper and deeper into Russian territory, millions of Russian peasants, those who were not drafted into the army, but their parents or their wives or their children, they fled. They abandoned their farms and fled because they didn't want to live in the part of Russia that the Germans were taking over. They became refugees and they crowded into the cities. And so now the cities had a problem because they had this influx of people who had to eat at a time, though, when there was not enough food being produced. And so the suffering of the Russian people during the war was enormous. Um, Add to that the fact that Russia's army was woefully under-equipped. As I mentioned before, Russia had not developed into a modern economy the way Britain, France, Germany, the United States had. Um, they didn't have enough factories to produce the kinds of things that soldiers needed to be successful in fighting a war. They didn't have enough guns, even something as basic as guns. During the First World War, only 1 out of every 4 Russian soldiers had a gun that worked. They were supposed to fix bayonets onto their guns and fight the Germans by jabbing the life out of them with their bayonets. Well, that wasn't realistic in a war where the Germans were armed with machine guns and heavy artillery with explosive shells. The average Russian soldier during World War I only carried 9 bullets. So even if they had a gun that worked, they had only 9 shots to fire during the entire war, on average. A German machine gun blasted out 9 bullets in a second. And so the Russian army was utterly, thoroughly, completely demoralized. Demoralized from the lack of adequate supply, demoralized from the fact that they knew that their wives, children, parents were suffering and didn't have enough to eat, demoralized by the fact that they had been defeated catastrophically by the Germans at Tannenberg and were now in a state of constant retreat. And millions of Russian, hundreds of thousands anyway, of Russian soldiers simply abandoned the army. The Tsar decided that he would take personal command of the army, that he would go out to the front and command the army himself. And he reasoned that his appearance at the front would re-inject new life into the Russian army and give them morale. No, he did. The reason why his army certainly couldn't be that they didn't have enough guns or bullets to fight the ultra-modern German army. That certainly couldn't be the problem. No, they just needed to see him in a leadership position. Well, of course, that didn't work. The Tsar's appearance at the front did not change the morale of the Russian army or change its fortunes or turn around the course of the war. If anything, it added to the problems because when he was not at the front, he could deflect blame for the failed war effort away from himself and toward his generals. But once Tsar Nicholas went out and took personal command of the army, and the tide of the war did not turn around, and the Russian army continued to lose and be driven backward, now there was no way for him to deflect that blame. And the Tsar himself came under withering criticism because even he, in personal command of his army, couldn't change their fortunes. So the war took a situation where already people were suffering, already people were miserable, and already they didn't like or trust their leadership. And it simply amplified all of those problems, simply made them worse. So you had a society that was already on the brink of a revolution, and then all the problems that put them on the brink of revolution were now multiplied and amplified by Russia's experience in the war. So one other thing I'd like to add before we finish this part of the story. There were other factors about the Tsar and his family that caused them to be suspected by the Russian people. And so I'm taking you down to the bottom of page 5 now. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra, who was called the Tsarina, that's the wife of a Tsar, the Tsarina. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra, was ethnically German at a time when Russia was fighting Germany. And that was a problem because people suspected her of siding with the Germans and basically working behind the scenes to sabotage Russia's war effort. And you say, "Oh, geez, what a stupid thing to do! Why would the Tsar marry a woman from a country that they were at war with. Well, here's the thing. They had been married for over 20 years by the time the war broke out. When the Tsar and Alexandra were married, there was no war between Russia and Germany. They were allies. They were friends. And so this was not a stupid or irresponsible act by Tsar Nicholas II. Don't get me wrong, Tsar Nicholas will commit plenty of stupid and irresponsible acts, but marrying Alexandra was not one of them. But now it became a problem because now Russia was at war with Germany, and Russia was losing the war, and they were losing badly. And so, for the Russian people, the fact that the Tsar's wife, that the Tsarina was ethnically German, that caused a lot of suspicion around the family, around the royal family, particularly when Nicholas II then went out to the front to command the army himself, because that left Alexandra alone in St. Petersburg to sort of manage, or in Petrograd, to sort of manage Russia's government and to sort of manage the war effort on the home front side. And so people who were not willing to accept that the Russian army's performance was due to like real flaws in Russia, like they don't have a modern economy and they can't produce enough guns and bullets for their soldiers. People who weren't prepared to accept that instead crafted all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories about the Tsarina Alexandra sabotaging Russia's war effort. Their explanation for why the army was performing badly was even more outrageous than Nicholas. Nicholas thought it was because he wasn't there to lead them, so he had to go out to the front. People who were suspicious of the Tsarina tried to argue that Russia was losing the war because she, as a German, was sabotaging Russia's war effort. The other thing that made people suspicious of the royal family was their relationship with a man named Gregory Rasputin, whom you see over there on the right-hand side. Rasputin was a former Russian Orthodox monk who had been kicked out of his monastery because he was a drunk and a womanizer. And you might look at that man and say, how did he become a womanizer in any form? I think the average woman would run away from him as quickly as possible. I don't know the answer to that, but he was kicked out of the monastery because he was a drunk and a womanizer. How then did this defrocked monk form a relationship with the royal family? Well, you see the little boy there, Alexei, who was called the Tsarevich. The Tsarevich is the oldest son, in this case, the only son of the Tsar. That is, he is the boy who will eventually become Tsar and succeed his father. Alexei suffered from a disease called hemophilia. And hemophilia, quite simply, is this. Remember that you've got in your blood, going back to 8th grade health, you've got red blood cells that carry oxygen, white blood cells that fight disease. You also have something called platelets, and they clot. So that when you get a cut or something, the platelets bond to each other and they form a clot in order to stop you from bleeding to death. A person who suffers from hemophilia, they don't have adequate platelets, or their platelets don't clot properly, and so there's the danger of a person with hemophilia bleeding to death if they just get a small cut or a scrape or a bruise. Now think about this. Alexei was a 9-year-old boy. He's going to get cuts and scrapes and bruises, and yet there was the danger every one of these could be life-threatening. Well, Rasputin wrote a letter to the family saying that he knew how to help Alexei. And as a matter of fact, he was able to provide assistance to Alexei. When he would get a cut and begin to bleed or a scrape, Rasputin would take him aside, usually into a private room. Would you trust your 9-year-old boy in a room with that guy? But that's what happened. And after about 20 minutes, the rest of the family would be invited in, and Alexei would be fine. Probably Rasputin was performing some sort of relaxation techniques, some sort of either meditation or even maybe hypnosis. The key being, he was probably doing something to get the boy's blood pressure down. Probably the first thing was just getting him away from his panicked parents. That might get his blood pressure down. but anything to get his blood pressure down so that the platelets that he did have could do their job. Because if your blood pressure is too high, it's just going to blow right through your platelets. But getting the blood pressure down through meditation or hypnosis or massage or something. But the bottom line is, whatever he was doing, Rasputin could help Alexei stop bleeding. And from that point on, Rasputin was with the royal family everywhere they went. He essentially became a member of the family. It was the Tsarina's insistence, as any mother would, that the man who could save her son be with them. Well, that just added to all the suspicions surrounding the family. Um, Rasputin was seen with suspicion. He's this mysterious figure. There were all sorts of rumors circulating that he was carrying on an affair with the Tsarina, that the Tsarina and Rasputin had an affair with each other. As a matter of fact, a lot of those rumors were actually spread by Russian nobles who resented Rasputin's influence with the royal family. But of course, all of those rumors and things just added to the distrust and the suspicion of the royal family at a time when Russia was already teetering on the brink of revolution, and it helped push Russia over toward revolution. So all of those factors set the stage for the revolution. Now, how the revolution actually happened is the story that you'll learn in the next section, and we'll get to that soon enough. But until then, take care of yourselves. Do your best to stay healthy and safe. I look forward to teaching you again soon. Bye-bye, Modern World History students.